Hey everybody, I just wanted to pop in for a moment. I'm going to do a more formal video and a more detailed response in my essay later on about the situation, if you want to call it that, in Memphis. I think it's important to talk about, but you're not going to see me talk about it in ways that other people have been talking about it. Usually I am not particularly topical, only when there is something very specific that perhaps I feel that I need to be able to say that no one else is saying. I've been getting some of the same responses. And the same responses very particularly and very candidly by white people. I'm going to go into this more. But I think that white people need to check their glee, need to check their rabid bloodlust. Because on the one hand, it seems pretty darn... Sorry about that. On the one hand, it seems pretty darn almost progressive, definitely empathic, definitely allyship to denounce in the strongest terms possible the black officers who brutally and unforgivably and inconceivably caused the death of that young man. But as I read in a post that was posted by Raina McCoy and attributed to someone else, I'm also including this because there's a nuance that I think that needs to be spoken of, and that nuance is this. Where is the name of the white police officer that tased and then egged on the officers? Where also are the names of the EMTs who stood and watched? And lastly, a reminder, and I'm going to speak to it more, a reminder that the reason that the very last clause of the Lace on Race mission statement, what we call our North Star, and I'll say it, lessening and mitigating the harm endured by black and brown people, perpetuated by white people, comma, and white supremacy. These were men operating from the bosom of a system that systematically oppresses black and brown people. We're going to talk about this more because to talk about it fully means to also talk about the failed promise. Just a moment. Sorry, dry mouth. Also talks about the failed promise of black and brown people going into institutions of oppression. Institutions of oppression. One of the very definitions of white supremacy. With a promise that they were going to be Esther and change systems and institutions from within. That they were not going to go into further and to further perpetuate the excesses and the harm and the violence of what's going on or what was going on. That they were going to come and through their very presence alone, as they rose through the ranks, that they would change the dynamic and the gestalt and the milieu of a system that is, particularly when it comes to black and brown people, inherently evil. A system that in many cities and towns was conceived of, at least at first, as a slave roundup for runaway slaves. This is a big conversation, whether or not it is possible to go into institutions and systems. And I, with a social work background, have felt this acutely. 35 years ago, am I lessening and mitigating harm, even though I was not using that terminology in the 80s? But am I lessening and mitigating the harm for the people I say I stand for and with, and why I got into the field in the first place? Or am I perpetuating violence and evil? I asked myself the same thing when I started working for the county. I spent most of my years in the county an auditor and controller, most specifically revenue and recovery, which is basically the county's collection agency. Now, there were times when I was absolutely on the side of the angels. When I did victim restitution, there was no question that I was helping people. But was I helping people when I was enforcing food stamps or cash aid that happened 7 years ago because there were no statute of limitations? Was I lessening and mitigating harm when I tried to defend the indefensible in terms of our policies? No, I was not. Now, I am not saying that the decisions that I made as part of that inherently flawed institution were comparable to what happened in Memphis. But let me tell you, and I can tell you this from the perspective of 2 years of being brutalized by a certain faction of people, there are very different kinds of deaths. There are physical deaths. There are psychic deaths. Neither of them should be perpetuated by anyone who says that they in any way align with North Star values. And this question cannot only be asked of police or social workers or county collection agencies. The same can be asked for medical professionals. The same can be asked for clergy. The same can be asked for the entire system that people call, with unironic voices, what people call the justice system. So we're looking at 2 things here that we're going to talk about more. The first thing that we're going to talk about is the fact that the unfettered glee and the unfettered calling out for blood of the officers who did the deed, justified though it is, cannot blind us to the fact that they were part of an institution that they chose to be in, but still an institution nonetheless. And also, and this is a tough needle to thread, I'm going to ask you to work with me on this. The idea that Black people, when they are in inherently problematic institutions and systems, are expected to be the moral standard, that we're expected to do more, that we're expected to be more, that we are sometimes censored, not just for doing funky stuff, violent stuff, I'll use the word, evil stuff, but for being on the sidelines. We've seen this in some instances of police brutality towards Black and brown people, and the person who stood by but did nothing, but did not actually do the deed, got more heat than the white counterparts who did. I want to flip this for a second. What if the officers who had done the deed in Memphis were white, but the EMTs had been Black? There would have been excoriation of them as well. So we have to hold 2 things in one hand. That As police like to say, our blood runs blue. So in a way, it doesn't matter the race of the officers who ultimately did the deed, but in a very real way, it also absolutely does. We're going to talk some more, I don't know to what depth, but we're going to talk some more about the history of the Memphis Police Department, which is very similar to a lot of police departments, particularly those south of the Mason-Dixon, but also particular in and of itself. We're going to talk about the swiftness of the punishment, however deserved. But when we are talking about how this plays out, we also have to think about how long it took. And it did take a while for other white officers in other jurisdictions across the country to face any sort of penalty for what they did. And even when they did, the white officer that was allowed to go home months and months and months and months later, even when they're found guilty, they find ways to get out of the worst of the accountability. And then when they're held accountable, there are always mitigating circumstances that absolve the white officers and an absolute demonization of the person who was harmed. This is important to remember. Again, I am very grateful for the reimagining and the reframing of the life of the young man who was killed. That should always be done. Everybody is more than who they are in one snapshot in time. But race matters. If that level of grace, and that's what I'm going to call it, if that level of grace and context is true for white officers, it should be true for black officers. You are not only who you are in a snapshot in time. I grieve along with the family of that young man because it doesn't matter at the end of the day what the melanin level was of the people who did the brutality. But it does matter. It absolutely does matter. The system under which they operate. This cannot only be an indictment and a prosecution of the officers who committed the heinous act. It also needs to be an indictment and prosecution and a deep dive into the Memphis Police Department itself, and for that matter, every single police department in the world, particularly in the United States, when it comes to its treatment of black and brown. I contend that it is embedded in the very culture of policing itself, that we are animals to be contained. Let's circle back before I leave to why that last part of the North Star, perpetuated by white people, and white supremacy. That lets no one off the hook. Because, as I have said for years and years, both before and during my tenure as Lace on Race, we're all racist. We're all white supremacists. We all think the worst of black and brown people, particularly black people, and most particularly black men. In the same way as I was taught to keep an eye out for Black and Latinx when I worked retail 40 years ago, while white shoppers robbed May Company blind, so it is here. We need to make sure that our energies and our outrage go smack where it belongs. And it's more encompassing than anybody wants to think. I grieve the trauma, and I grieve the loss of yet another promising young soul. But hey, aren't they all promising young souls? And when I talk about taking a deep dive into policing, that also means we take a deep dive into ourselves. Because guess what? We fund them. In 2020, during the height of the Black Spring, there were calls for substantive and meaningful police reform, and there was some whitewashing and a little bit of window dressing, but for the most part, once everything died down in the Black Spring, so did that. If nothing else, let this be a reminder for us that we have to be as relentless as the systems and institutions are. It can't be a one and done. We're going to talk more about it later. I am about to go and finalize my address for our yearly annual board meeting. I'm pretty sure I get to keep my job, but I'm going to make sure that I write a good address to make sure I do. And we're going to talk more about the fact that in order to fight systems and institutions, there needs to be spaces just like this one. Not just mine, not only mine. I am not the only game in town. But there needs to be people who place pressure on policing, place pressure on the justice system so that substantive change could be made. If Memphis and other police departments across the country had actually been serious about implementing change that meant something in a sustainable and relentlessly reliable way, maybe we would still be having this conversation. Maybe not. But the fact that it didn't happen, not just in Memphis, but anywhere else, the fact that it didn't happen guaranteed that this conversation did.